Okay, I think we can get started. Good morning and welcome to the Europe Center. My name is Christophe Crombez. Today we are having an event on the new European security order, the new EU foreign policy, the role of NATO in it, the role of France and Germany. This event is co-organized with the consulates of France and Germany here in San Francisco. And before we get started and before I introduce the speakers, I would briefly like to give the word to both Consul Generals, Frédéric Jung and Oliver Schramm. Frédéric.
Thank you very much, Christophe. Welcome to all viewers to this webinar, which is entitled A New European Security Order, ? I will get back to this title in a moment, but I just wanted to give a few elements of context about how we got to this seminar. France is currently chairing the European Union, the Council of the European Union, and it is doing so locally here in San Francisco for this entire year. And Germany is chair of the G7, and so with my German colleague Oliver Schramm, who will speak in a second, we decided to do a series of events together, and this seminar is one of them. And we are actually very happy to have been able to organize this in coordination with the Europe Center of Stanford. And I want really to thank you, Christophe, for allowing this to happen. I also want to thank our panelists, our two panelists who are joining us from Europe. It's already 8 p.m. In Europe right now, but they will be introduced by you, Christophe, in a second. So this panel will be addressing the question of European security and European defense, which is obviously a very burning issue given the ongoing war led by Russia in Ukraine, and that started on the 24th of February. And this war has already cost of course, thousands of Ukrainian lives and pushed millions of Ukrainians to flee their country. But as for the European Union, this crisis, this war is also a turning point, and this is really what I want to briefly look at. Of course, it has challenged the EU in the way that it has led the EU to provide support, humanitarian support, of course, to Ukraine, to welcome, to host Ukrainian refugees in Europe, and 100,000 of them are being hosted as we're speaking in France, 700,000, I believe, in Germany. Maybe Oliver will be more specific on this figure. It has led us also to shift economically, and the European Council that took place yesterday night is an illustration of this, with a consensus of all Europeans, of all the European member states, to actually reduce by 92% their dependence on Russian oil and a new set of sanctions. So that's I think a big shift away from our dependency towards Russia economically. And of course, and this is, I think, the point of today's discussion, a radical strategic shift. Initially, I want to just recall that defense wasn't part of a European project. It was rejected actually partially by France in the early 50s, the project of having a political European project. And so Europe was built on mostly economic ties. But with Maastricht and Lisbon in 92, 99, a political component was added to the European construction. And we have now a common security and defense policy, but which is still in construction, I would say. Yes, we have European missions outside of the EU, actually 17 of them, I believe, right now. We have objectives, strategies. We're discussing of a strategic compass. But we still have many European states that are quite shy in this regard, and that want to rely more on NATO than on the European Union to discuss and build strategic and defense matters. But we've had in the recent period some wake-up calls that I want to highlight. That recall that we cannot only rely on NATO and on the US for our security. One of them being the evacuation of Kabul, which was very complicated and which showed I would say maybe a potential for more coordination with between the US and the EU. France went through the AUKUS crisis with the US also, this alliance on the Pacific, which showed that also there was a lack of coordination between the US and a major and old European ally. And finally, more globally, I would say that the entire pivot of the US towards the Pacific has led the US to be less involved in European security and defense. And of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed this and has led to major shifts in many regards. Of course, NATO is in a way very strengthened. We see the new requests for joining NATO. But within the EU, that also changed dramatically, I think, the state of mind. And maybe as a French diplomat, I can address more the German issue. It might be less easy for Oliver, but it's quite striking, this change, this dramatic change that Germany is going through on defense matters. This announcements of 100 billion euros announced by Germany to reinforce its armed forces, be up to the 2% defense spendings, the objective set by NATO. Also supplying tanks, Gepard tanks, howitzer artillery to a neighboring country. This is unseen before, would have been unimaginable before this crisis. So we are really seeing German foreign policy and defense policy making bold shifts, and this is really changing, I think, the potential for European ambition on security and defense matters. So where does this lead us? France is more than ever willing, to build strategic autonomy. Before the Ukraine crisis, it was already set as a priority of the current European Union presidency to get to, because it is a part of reinforcing European sovereignty as a whole. And we probably now have a great potential for not only a French impulse on this, like it has been the case in the past decades, but a coordinated German and French impulse. But many questions still lie ahead. Questions that were discussed actually at the March summit in Versailles on these issues. How will this potential leap forward regarding European defense be funded? Will it lead to further European integration, for example, through common lending to pay for these spendings? Will it come also with technological and industrial leap forward? Because obviously you need to, if you want to become a strategic power, you need to be able to build tanks, fighter jets, drones together. So that's another question. And finally, what governance will it be an integrated governance? Will it be a coordinated governance? So I think there are many questions still open, and I'm looking forward to the elements of discussion that will be shared by our two panelists in a minute. But without further ado, I will now give the floor to my German colleague, Oliver. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Frederick. Wonderful. Thank you also for already introducing and highlighting some of the major elements that have kind of imprinted German foreign politics in the last 2 months, and very thankful for already highlighting some of the major shifts that might come up in the follow-up of this tragedy. I just wanted to say hello to everyone, to Christophe, to Frederick, of course, to Pierre, Haroche, Gisela, Müller-Brandeck-Bocquet, and then to all the participants of this event. This day, it's a real honor, and I think it's an extraordinary topic. But first and foremost, I would like to thank you, Frederick, for jointly initiating yet another wonderful project of as Franco-German partners here in San Francisco. We have already had a number of events and appearances this year. I think on average one per month, and I think that frequency and rhythm tells a lot, I think, about the level of friendship and cooperation that we enjoy. And I'm looking very much forward to more of these future initiatives that are, by the way, never exclusive, but open to other European international partners here in San Francisco as well. Et alors, encore merci pour la grande coopération et ton amitié, Frédéric. Big thank you as well to the Europe Institute, of the Freeman Spogli Institute, for the Europe Center, at the Freeman Spogli Institute, and to its director, Christophe, for hosting, moderating this timely and highly topical discussion. I think the Europe Center is always and has always been a fantastic partner for many of us European consulate generals here in the Bay Area, and with its highly intellectual and highly diverse faculty, the center provides enormous insights and benefits to many of us here. Thank you again for your interest and your willingness to bring this event about. And finally, also a thank you to the sponsoring institutions from the German side, the IFA, short for Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen, Institute for Foreign Relations in Stuttgart and Berlin, for supporting and sponsoring a high-level cultural and political dialogue like this one today. The Auswärtiges Amt German Foreign Office in Berlin is proud to see what a wonderful work, many events and publications the IFA is able to realize with its budget contributions already for almost a century now. Ladies and gentlemen, I quote, "Unless we act, events that we Europeans will be unable to influence will overtake us. I believe we Europeans feel far too safe unless we defend and adjust ourselves to new conditions. History has shown that civilizations are all too perishable." And another quote, "European integration should not be rigid, but as flexible as we can possibly make it. It should not be a straitjacket for the peoples of Europe, but should be their common mainstay." Not my words, of course, but those of Konrad Adenauer while addressing the Grande Conférence Catholique in September 1956. How almost prophetic, and sadly, how super recent that sounds in a Europe that is currently at day 97 of a brutal war of aggression right in the heart of Eastern Europe, with headlines and breaking news by the hour about ongoing atrocities and a level of destruction and violence long forgotten in the more than 7 decades of successful European integration. Looking back, we see an era that surely the European founding fathers, Monnet, Schuman, De Gasperi, Adenauer, and others had dreamt of, but ultimately turned out to be a time of peace, of stability, that no European generation had never, ever enjoyed before. After centuries of constant bloodshed and confrontation, finally a prospering Europe in harmony. And yes, of course, there were exceptions and conflicts in our neighborhood and even on European soil during that time, thinking of the bitter and violent war of secession in Yugoslavia some 30 years ago in the wake of our continent overcoming the divisions of the Cold War. But now we have this, a most unexpected, if not almost unreal, war of aggression happening in the middle of our continent, lending itself only to comparisons with Hitler's and Nazi Germany's war of annihilation in Eastern Europe. Could it have been prevented? Did it befall a Europe completely unprepared and lacking in fundamental military and political capabilities? To the former, I have no definitive answer. To the latter, I would reply, not quite so. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the common foreign security policy that Frederick already mentioned, in short, CFSP, started first in 1970 as the then called European Political Cooperation, as a first step and security element of an ever more closely integrated and integrating Europe, later European Union, in lockstep and coordination with our transatlantic partners in NATO, under the motto separable but not separate. And since 1999, implementing also their own missions of peacekeeping and policing of treaties. And it was exactly the already mentioned war in Yugoslavia that led to many changes in the European external and security posture, step by step along the lines of important milestones and treaties like the Maastricht Treaty, the Amsterdam Treaty, creating the Office of the High Representative of CFSP, and finally the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009, instituting an EU Commissioner for External Relations and creating the European External Action Service, intended as a common foreign office or diplomatic corps for the EU. Other important new elements on the journey were the creation of the Foreign Affairs Council, the European Defence Agency, the introduction of the mutual defense clause, or in 2017, most importantly, the start of the so-called permanent structured cooperation, the PESCO, structural integration of 25 of 27, something like a military Schengen, if you will. And finally, the formation of transnational military units like the European Corps, the Euro Corps, EU battle groups, or way back already in 1989, the 6,000 men strong Franco-German brigade. All of this just to illustrate to you that Europe, or the EU, not only economically has come a long way since the end of World War II, but that a lot of progress has been made over time in the field of CFSP as well. When I say over time, I accept that although European integration as it stands today seemed unimaginable back in 1950, more than 70 years is still quite a long time. And it is no secret that this process has seen often standstill and many setbacks. I just mentioned Brexit at this point, which I had to deal with in my last posting in London before arriving in San Francisco. And today we are faced with a crisis, a war obliterating most previous scenarios by far and making crystal clear that the known structures of our CFSP that already before this shock wave needed an overhaul, think migration, appear now rather insufficient to be able to come to terms with what we witnessed since February 24. The good news, Europe is more united than some might have thought it would be, and it is able to react. The Russian aggression has strengthened European and transatlantic resolve and determination. Long-held political principles had to be thrown overboard. Frederick already mentioned the Zeitenwende, or the turning point in English, announced by German Chancellor Scholz. Energy supplies are to be adapted in record time. As of yesterday, no less than 6 sanctions packages have been agreed, hurting and crippling the Russian economy and military capabilities. And even on topics where unanimity is required, but not always possible, the EU is able to agree to a compromise solution as seen during the past 24 hours with regard to the import sanctions on Russian oil. And I regard the close and steadfast synchronicity with which President Macron and Chancellor Scholz act under a lot of pressure, both international and domestic, and in the face of adversity and complex decision-making, as a great example of European solidarity and leadership. But let me be clear, this horrendous conflict is certainly not a success story for Europe, far from it. And how could it? Faced with such heinous aggression of one country's reckless leadership against the neighboring state, a former brother people, and its democratically elected government, how could it be? But it forces us to rethink and to strengthen our positions militarily, politically, and economically, and our moral values too. And believe me, as a German diplomat, explaining where we come from historically and what we want to try to achieve in coordination with our European and international partners is at times all but easy. But again, this is understandable given the circumstances. And believe me when I say that the biggest critics with the seemingly quickest and easiest solutions on offer, you will mostly find in Germany itself. But make no mistake, Europe's resolve will not weaken. Russia's aggression will not pay off. Ukraine will remain an independent, free, and democratic country. But we must all learn from this, and quickly. Dramatic change is already on the way, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, for instance, and with Ukraine starting the accession procedure to become an EU member state in a hopefully not too distant future. If anything, I see this as a clear and unmistakable vote for our democratic values and structures at the core of our Euro-Atlantic alliance. And as history will demonstrate, I see this as a major setback for our so-called systemic rivals around the world. To put an end to my long words and finally clear the stage for today's experts, I will stick with the vision of the great Jean Monnet, who once said, "There's no future for the people of Europe other than in union." So let's be hopeful despite everything and work for that union of the European families together with our American partners and friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver and Frédéric. I will now introduce our two speakers. We have a speaker from Germany and a speaker from France. First, I'll introduce our German speaker. She will also go first in her opening remarks. We have Gisela Müller-Brandeck-Bocquet with us. She's the Jean Monnet Professor and Professor of European Studies and International Relations at the University of Würzburg. Her main research interests are in integration studies, especially European foreign and security policy, as well as the institutional and constitutional development of the European Union, and also German foreign and European policy. Our speaker from France is Pierre Haroche. Pierre is a research fellow in European security at the Institute for Strategic Research, IRSEM, in Paris. I don't know exactly how you pronounce the acronym, but I gave it a shot. His research focuses on the theory of European integration, European defense cooperation, and the evolution of European institutions. So we will have first Gisela make some opening remarks. For the audience, I would like to point out that you are very welcome, of course, to ask questions. We will have a Q&A session after the opening remarks by Gisela and Pierre. In order to ask your questions, you can use the Q&A feature that you can find at the bottom of your screen, and then just enter your questions, type in your questions. I will then, during the Q&A session, go through the questions that you have asked. So in order to use the Q&A feature, you do not have to wait until Gisela and Pierre are done with their opening remarks. You can just start asking your questions as Gisela and Pierre are speaking. That being said, I would like to pass the floor to Gisela. She will talk for 5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, and hi to everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk a little bit on this exciting topic of a new European security order. I want to address the issue with, in fact, 3 points only. First, I want to start to make some remarks on with regard to CFSP and CSDP of the European Union. So we already heard common foreign and security policy and common security and defense policy. As a latecomer in the process of the uniting of Europe, CFSP and CSDP are the weakest bricks in the complex construction of the EU treaties. Unanimity is required for all decisions. Furthermore, the member states are by far the most important players in CFSP and CSDP, even though the High Representative, nowadays Josep Borrell from Spain, has an increasingly important word to say. With regard to CFSP, discussions are under the way to abolish the unanimity rule. This, for example, would ease a lot the decision on sanctions, which nowadays still require unanimity, but the reform process is just starting, so maybe we come back to this later. Second remark, the strengthening of the common security and defense policy is a very old topic within the European integration process. With France having for decades claimed a strong, independent puissance, power Europe, and with Germany having equally constantly opted for the NATO solution to provide security for Europe. So this conflict, very often a rather silent conflict, is very old. Now we have, with the famous Sorbonne speech of September 2017 by Emmanuel Macron, we have a new momentum for creating a strong and autonomously capable Europe. Thus, under the shock of the Brexit referendum and the Trump election, a new discussion arose concerning the establishment of an EU army or an army of the Europeans, as the Germans prefer to name such an undertaking. And I want to remind you, without the United Kingdom, several achievements could be reached in recent years, such as the already mentioned launch of PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation. This advancement would not have been possible with the Brits still on board. Brexit entails furthermore that the former big three of CFSP and CSDP have turned into the big two. This means that today Germany and France are bearing even more responsibility for the EU in general and CFSP and CSDP in particular. So let us turn toward my second point, the present situation. The traditional Franco-German leadership within the European Union, this famous engine for integration, is challenged at present by Eastern and Baltic member states. They accuse Paris and Berlin of being too lenient, too indulgent with Russia. The frequent phone calls of Macron and Scholz with Putin are seen with a bad eye. Mainly Warsaw and evidently Kiev think that France and Germany have not yet understood the real threat that Russia represents for Europe as a whole, and even for peace and security on a global level. The remarks made by Emmanuel Macron recently in Strasbourg maybe were unfortunate, because he called on the Europeans not to humiliate Russia. Germany, at the other hand, is accused to not provide Ukraine sufficiently with weapons and other military equipment. So these both arguments put together mean that this famous Franco-German leadership is really challenged at present. I want, in contrast to these accusations, I want to point again, Mr. Schramm made it already, to these Zeitenwende, the turnaround, this major shift that Chancellor Scholz declared in his speech on February 27th. He talked about a Zeitenwende turnaround for Germany's security and defense policy. Crucial here is the announcement of €100 billion that Berlin will spend for the German army, the Bundeswehr. This has already been mentioned, but it is important to note that this financial package was definitely decided yesterday, Monday evening. This decision, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said, makes sure that NATO can rely on Germany. In my eyes, this Zeitenwende decision provides evidence that Germany has comprehensively realized the scope of the geopolitical and security changes triggered by the Russian aggression of February 24th. This brings me to my third and last point. How could a new European security order look like? The Europeans, under the shocks already mentioned, mainly the Trump presidency with Trump saying that maybe NATO has become obsolete. This all triggered the Europeans in the very last years to strengthen their military capabilities. On the individual level, I already mentioned the German example, but also on the European level. We already heard about PESCO, which is an important strengthening of the European military capabilities. But I also want to mention that High Representative Borrell, end of May, announced a large EU armament project. The money, Borrell said, is not meant for a rearmament, but for altering the silent disarmament of Europe that had taken place in the last years. He calls for much more cooperation and common armament project between the member states. This finally is also the intent of PESCO, that the European armies, the individual armies, cooperate more in order to create and engender more strengths. These recent steps, PESCO, armament project, and all this stuff, this mean that are these first steps towards the European EU army? This is the question. For the time being, I clearly would say no, this does not engender an EU army. All the European efforts at the moment to enhance their security contributions will strengthen NATO, and this even more if Sweden and Finland are allowed to join the alliance. To go beyond NATO would be unacceptable for all the Eastern member states at the moment. So all the additional efforts of the last years to strengthen the military or the individual armies just benefit in the first place NATO for the moment. NATO is so strong and united as it has never been in the last decades. But we do not have any warrant that this will last. Times may come back when a US president declares NATO obsolete and where the US again turn away from Europe. Therefore, it lies in Germany's and France's responsibility to continue to lead the EU reliably towards greater capacity to act, towards enhanced agency. And here I want to point to the fact that in the last 5 years, since Brexit and the Trump presidency, both countries, France and Germany, have developed in common a new role model for the European Union, a new leitmotif for the EU. And I'm talking about the new magic word of European sovereignty or European autonomy or European strategic sovereignty. Those are the key words of the debates of the last years in order to depict the possible future of the European Union. Though an effort to strengthen the European capacities to act not only in a military sense, but mainly this topic of European sovereignty in 2017-18 mainly meant that the European Union must become stronger in its industrial policy with regard to China, for example, must become more autonomous with regard to medical equipment that had not been there during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this word of European sovereignty also addresses a lot the necessary European leadership in climate policy. But now, after the brutal war against Ukraine, it has become even more evident that such a European sovereignty must not only include these already mentioned policy fields, but also security and defense policy. This is mandatory for the years to come in the light of the possibility that once again we will stand more or less alone. So this Zeitenwende, this major shift of the world politics must definitively lead the Europeans to more willingness and capacity to act for their own security. We already have heard that these wake-up calls, it's not the first wake-up call we had within the European Union. And each time after Iraq war, for example, there was some kind of new momentum to enhance CFSP and CSDP. But then with the change in the White House in the US, we forgot about this necessity to unite in these policy fields. And Mr. Schramm already mentioned other wake-up calls, but I think that now things have really changed. And this maybe it should be the last and final wake-up call for Europe to become stronger in these policy fields, to cooperate very closely with NATO. I mean, as I said already, all the Eastern member states would never agree in another solution, but we must prepare for the future, and nobody knows how long this war will last and how to reconstruct with Russia or against Russia a new security architecture. All this will be very demanding issues, and what is needed first is that the European countries are decided to do more for their security than in the past. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Gisela. I'd like to give the word to Pierre now.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to comment on these very important issues. I just want to say first that the wars are tragedies, but they also reveal things. For instance, on the ground in Ukraine, it revealed the true strength of the Ukrainian military, something that not so many people expected before. And it also revealed the true strength of other actors that are not necessarily active on the ground, like the European Union. And I find it interesting to compare statements before or during the Ukrainian crisis that preceded the war and during the war. For instance, in December 2021, the High Representative Borrell said that there was a risk that decisions could be adopted over Europeans' head. So he expressed the fear that decisions could actually bypass Europeans, that the European Union could be marginalized in this debate, because it seemed at that moment that Russia did not really consider the European Union as a valid interlocutor, focusing instead on the United States, on actual power, not on the European Union, which is not seen as an actual power. And more recently, in May, Lavrov said that, according to him, the European Union was evolving was increasingly similar to NATO and increasingly aggressive. And in a way, it revealed the fact that the European Union seemed more of a credible and serious actor than it used to be. And also, I noticed Ukrainian foreign minister's statement in Davos when he said that initially Ukrainians considered NATO as a very solid and important alliance, whereas the EU was seen as a weak organization. And eventually he saw that the European Union adopted very important decisions that few people expected it to be able to take, whereas NATO, according to him, was not so active. So in a way, it also revealed the true potential of the Union, this war. First, through the sanctions, because we can discuss about the true effectiveness of the sanctions and Russia's ability to circumvent these sanctions, but nevertheless, very important and unprecedented sanctions were adopted already starting in February. Second, the question of armament, weapon delivery to Ukraine. There was a very new instrument, the European Peace Facility, that had been negotiated for years. So many member states were very reluctant to accept this instrument, to accept the possibility that the European Union could actually provide lethal military equipment to third parties. And then during the war, when Russia invaded Ukraine, not only did the European Union use that instrument, but it used it much more and much more clearly than it was expected. Now the European Union reimbursed 2 billion euros of 400 billion euros of military equipment to Ukraine. So these are just examples of how the European Union became the security actor that itself was not necessarily certain it was at that time. Other examples include Finland and Sweden before asking to join NATO. They all stated clearly, the Finnish and Swedish prime ministers, that they expected the European Union to be also a security provider in the framework of Article 42.7. It was also mentioned in today's European Council's conclusion. Also, Denmark will have a referendum tomorrow on the possibility to join the common security and defense policy because of the situation in Ukraine. And last but not least, Ukraine, with its bid to join the European Union, it's very clear that it's not based on economic considerations, but on security considerations. And for Ukraine, being an EU member would be seen as, in a way, some kind of security guarantee. So this war already revealed that the European Union, although it is supposed to be essentially active in overseas crises, not necessarily a strong actor in terms of the collective defense of Europeans on that continent, that is NATO's job. Nevertheless, it is seen as part of the solution when it comes to defending Europeans and a security provider. Second, I wanted to say that this war was also a catalyst that accelerated trends that were already there. The first of these trends was the trends toward geo-economic power. It's not only a European thing. That's also something that the US-China rivalry accelerated. The idea that economic exchanges are now increasingly weaponized, and the objectives are not only economic. The objectives of economic exchanges is not just to increase the growth and prosperity. They are also strategic. The question being, am I vulnerable to the other, to my adversary? Who is more dependent than the other? Who has leverage over the other in an economic exchange? Already the COVID crisis revealed the importance of the economy as a weapon and not just as an autonomous sector with the objective of with purely economic objectives. The European Union and the European Commission already started during the COVID crisis to develop this concept of open strategic autonomy, to develop new instruments to integrate international security and great power competition considerations into their economic policies. Examples include the 5G toolbox, of course, in close coordination with the US, but also foreign direct investment screening, proposals on anti-coercion instruments vis-a-vis China, and questions of debates on adapting the EU competition policy to integrate, to take into account China's influence and so on. So the EU was already prepared before the war in Ukraine to have a strategic approach to economic policies. And now it's even clearer in the case of Ukraine, because for many military reasons, the possibility of direct military involvement has been put, is out of the question. So the battlefield between Russia and Western powers is essentially an economic battlefield. So it means that sanctions, but also things like dependence, asymmetric dependence, energy security, food security, and so on, industrial security, raw material security of supply, all of these questions that are traditional European Union competence and that are traditional European Commission competence in its capacity as the manager of the single market are becoming de facto strategic issues. So in a way, we have some kind of de facto integration in the sense that issues that were purely economic in the past are now also strategic. So EU's competence in these areas become also instruments, foreign policy instruments and security instruments, and are closely linked and connected to defense policies. Second trend that is confirmed, the fact that through financial instruments, through budgetary instruments, the European Union can be more active and also illustrate and demonstrate its complementarity vis-à-vis NATO. Already a few years ago, the European Union launched the European Defence Fund, investing the European Union budget in defence research and development, but it was limited to development, that is to say, military prototypes, without going further. And now there is already a discussion on whether the European Union budget should be used to subsidize acquisition, so not just prototype, but actual weapons for member states' armies. And it was actually debated today at the European Council that welcomed the European Commission plan for to create new instruments to subsidize, in particular, joint procurement, but not just facilitating joint procurement, but also to subsidize them with the European Union budget. So in a way, perhaps this is the starting point of an actual European defense budget. And the debate has just started. So, and that would be my conclusion. We see that the war in Ukraine can, in a way, demonstrate that the European Union is much more important as a security provider than people anticipated to be, and also it accelerates the trend that could lead to new steps in European integration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pierre. All right, we can now have a Q&A session. So as I mentioned in the beginning, for the members of the audience, you can ask your questions using the Q&A feature, and then I will read your question and ask them to the panelists. While you are entering your questions, maybe I'll ask a couple of questions myself. I'll ask the following question first. I think Gisela mentioned in the beginning that in the Baltic states, France and Germany are sort of considered to be a bit too soft on Putin. And I would say that here in the US, that perception is often also the case. And when I talk to colleagues here or friends, when I read the media, France and Germany are to some extent portrayed as being too soft on Putin. There's concern that France and Germany will want to agree to territorial concessions that Ukraine would have to make. So I was wondering to what extent France and Germany are aware of that, are concerned about this perception, to what extent they are concerned about NATO and European Union unity. Is there a lot of interaction to come to a common position rather than France and Germany going out and stating their positions before trying to come to a common position with other EU member states? Either of you or both?
Maybe I start with Germany, because as you know, especially the German policy towards Russia of the last 2 or 3 decades has become under strong pressure and really touches the self-understanding of some political parties in Germany. The SPD, for example, who had made the great change in the late 60s with Chancellor Willy Brandt to try to go for a new Ostpolitik, which rendered some kind of coexistence possible between the GDR and the Federal Republic of Germany. All these steps towards for opening towards Russia and the Soviet Union at the time has become under strong criticism in the last months since the start of the war. I do not know what Pierre will answer for France, but Macron too, he tried to establish especially intense relations to Putin with 2 years ago, he invited him and all this. I think the problem is if you, now we should not throw the bath with the child, as there is a German saying, and we will have after the war to live with Russia on this continent. So I think it's natural that we try to think about the post-war order. And this I think was the sense of the Macron sentence of we should not humiliate Putin too much. I know that Chancellor Scholz, for example, he is real under pressure by all the accusation coming from Ukraine. And I do not know how this will really end, because within his proper party, there are a lot of people who do not feel like really delivering heavy weapons to Ukraine. So you have all this mixture of, we must be careful to not become a war party. We must have a look to how will we be able to talk to Russia after the war. All these are problems that I think some other countries are not so much caring about, such as the Baltic states, for example, or even the US. I mean, you are not on the same continent with Russia as we are. So we have to think about the future. But a very complicated topic, and I think it's very difficult, mainly for these two countries, to find the equilibrium between strength and clearness. Yes, we help Ukraine, and not to cut all the bridges, all the relations with Russia for the future. Very complicated.
Thank you very much for the question. First, to a certain extent, I think that both positions are, and that of France and Germany on the one hand, and that of Eastern European countries criticizing Macron and Scholz, are complementary. I'll explain my position. If you want to have a lasting peace, yes, you have to make the war costly for Russia. And I think, for instance, Kaja Kallas, the Estonian Prime Minister, had an interview in the New York Times in which he said that it has to be costly, otherwise Russia will try something similar again in 1 year, in 2 years, and all of this will be repeated, and peace would have been an illusion. And I think it is completely correct. But on the other hand, if peace is too costly, you can end up in a situation in which there is no interest for Russia to accept a peaceful settlement, and the only interesting option would be escalation. If a peaceful settlement is seen by Russian elites as a total catastrophe and total collapse of the Russian state, and this is a topic that is already discussed in the Russian media, the idea that eventually the West's final objective is to have something similar to the 1917 revolution in Russia, or something similar to the collapse of the USSR. That is a close connection between international relations difficulties and the collapse of the regime. If Russian elites have this impression, they might end up with the idea that eventually they have nothing to lose, and the only sensible option is escalation. And we know that Russia is a nuclear power. So this is also something we don't want Russia to anticipate. So there is a fine line between these two incentives, making peace sufficiently costly so that there is no incentive to do it again in the future, but not too costly so that there is still an incentive to accept peace and not to jump to escalation. And about the debate between Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans, I think it's true, and I think it has to be addressed. But I would like to underline the fact that there are also other debates in which the cleavage is a bit different. We talked about the question of financial instruments or financial initiatives. And in this particular debate, it's a bit different because France is very much in favor of having ambitious financial instruments, in particular in support of military acquisition. Eastern European countries are also very favorable to creating new financial incentive, financial instruments to support European Union's effort in this war in Ukraine. And the country with which I would say France might have some difficulties in this negotiation, perhaps, is Germany. So the debates are not necessarily all aligned on this one single cleavage between the West and the East. And sometimes it's a bit different. But yes, it has to be addressed. But I think that also President Macron, for instance, tried to be very clear about the fact that he never encouraged Ukrainians to make territorial concessions. He never discussed anything with Putin that was not previously discussed and accepted by Ukrainians. So it's not a parallel negotiation canal. It's not like another crypto diplomacy trying to circumvent the discussion between Ukraine and Russia. And also, we can remind ourselves about the Cold War, when there were tensions between the U.S. president and the Soviet leaders. They established the red line to facilitate discussion, to avoid again misperceptions, misunderstandings, and escalation. And actually, it's not at the same level, but there are now regular discussions between the Pentagon and the Russian Ministry of Defense, precisely for that same reason, to be clear and to avoid misunderstandings. So I think there is also a merit in this connections, if only to avoid unintended escalation.
All right. Related to that somewhat, both of you, I think, at some point mentioned or referred to public opinion in Europe. I've been surprised myself as to how favorable public opinion has been, how much sympathy there has been from the very first days of the war for the people of Ukraine. After all, in the past, there was not always that much enthusiasm about Eastern European countries, and the one referendum that was held on a trade agreement with an association agreement with Ukraine in the Netherlands did not pass. So there's been a big outpour of sympathy for Ukraine, and I was wondering to what extent there's maybe a push from public opinion to go further, to be harsher on Russia. I'm asking that question also in relation to a question asked by a member of the audience who would favor a harsher stance and even a declaration of war. Is there any pressure in Europe from the public to be harsher on Russia? And maybe importantly also, how long will this wave of sympathy last? In the end, I think it will be important when there are, suppose there are negotiations at some point, or a standstill or whatever between Russia and Ukraine, as economic difficulties continue in Europe. Is this wave of sympathy going to last, and is this going to impact foreign policy? Either of you or both?
I can start. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I noticed, for instance, opinion polls conducted in Spain before the invasion of Ukraine. I think only 5% of the Spanish population considered Russia as a threat. And after the invasion of Ukraine, a majority of the Spanish population considered Russia not only as a threat, but as the #1 threat, even for Spain itself, not just for Europe. So yes, it hugely affected public opinion. And I think also the sympathy you mentioned vis-a-vis Ukraine was also interesting when he made his speech in front of the European Parliament. The Ukrainian President Zelensky, he said, through this war, we have demonstrated that we were Europeans, and it's now up to you to show that you are Europeans. And I think that in a way it reflects how the public opinion evolved at the beginning of the war. Ukrainians were seen as, by many people, as a failed state, or perhaps a dysfunctional state, or a state that eventually is very close to Russia, or eventually will have to go back to the Russian sphere of influence. And many people were actually impressed by what they discovered, the actual potential and the actual courage and the actual willingness of the Ukrainian people to be independent, to preserve its democratic values, and to be closer to the West than to Russia. And it really affected public opinion. But it can also connect with the previous debate, because I think that one of the reasons it can be important for leaders to maintain a dialogue with Russia, it is also to demonstrate to the public opinion that if there is a conflict, if there are tensions with Russia, it's not because the West is aggressive, it's not because the West doesn't want to talk to Russia, it's because Russia has decided to put itself in a corner by being aggressive. Because yes, in certain European countries, not only in Western Europe, there are some, let's say, pro-Russian political parties that would be happy to accuse governments to be too aggressive or to favor war over a peaceful settlement. But it's harder to make this point if it is clear that actually there is a discussion with Russians, and it is actually Russians' decision not to desescalate and to go back to the possible peaceful discussion.
To be harsher towards Russia. I mean, this is a big issue. One of you already mentioned the total of the sanctions and the measures the European Union took against Russia. And it's Pierre, I think you were the one. And it's very important sanctions, economic sanctions. I think those who say be harsher towards Russia means stop gas importation immediately. And here we have in Germany a big discussion. Yes, it's okay to stop import from Russian oil and coal very soon, but for gas, it's more complicated. And it's easier for Spain and France to call for an immediate stop of importation, also to import Russian gas, than it is for Germany and mainly the eastern countries who just have this Druzhba pipeline. So I mean, this is the problem of the European Union. No, it's the nature of the European Union to have countries, member states with very different perceptions, geographical situations, and interests. But I mean, I think the compromise they just have found, the European Council had found last night, how to stop or to reduce gas importation from Russia is probably a very intelligent one. The countries who cannot, for the next winter, completely renounce to Russian gas are the countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and Czech Republic. So we must find a solution. But in fact, I wanted to address a topic which we just touched a very little bit, the question of the future accession of Ukraine, Moldavia, and Georgia to the European Union. And here for sure we will have very, very complicated talks in the future, because I mean, we have you remember the big crisis Ukraine versus Russia started in 2013 around this association agreement, Ukraine, European Union. This was the starting point of this revolution in Kiev in 2013, which then triggered all the problems with annexation of Crimea and so on. And what had happened since then? We have this association agreement with Ukraine, and we know that Ukraine, they did not advance a single step in fighting corruption, in adopting to European standards and so on. I mean, Zelensky is doing a marvelous job in this war, but the years before, he and his predecessor, they didn't do nothing to come closer to European standards with regard to fighting corruption, for example. So personally, I'm of those who say we cannot have a fast-track accession procedure for Ukraine. And we have to find an in-between solution. Yeah, Macron is talking of this European political community. Mitterrand, in the time he talked of a European confederation. And we must find new settings where we integrate more and closely for security issues, as you said, Ukraine, but we cannot have a special Ukrainian accession procedure. We would, it just would be the end of the European Union. So, because all the countries of the Balkans who are waiting since 15, 20 years now to become member states, it would for them not be understandable or acceptable that we now find a fast track, as Zelensky said, fast track procedure for Ukrainian accession. But this will be very hard. I mean, this will be a very complicated process, how to give Ukraine some guarantees with regard to mainly security, to give them a perspective for EU accession, but to be very clear on it that they just have to fulfill the condition as all the other candidate states. And I'm sure there will be a lot of quarrels within the European Union.
Will they get candidate status this year, you think?
In June, we will know more, because the Commission must give a first impression, opinion, if it is possible to give candidate state status to Ukraine. No, I cannot. We have to wait for this Commission statement.
Does Pierre have any thoughts on the Ukrainian accession to the European Union?
Yes. Well, the Ukrainian government now doesn't ask for a fast track. It just asks for a clear candidate status, and I think this is something that is realistic, because candidate status doesn't mean that it will happen overnight. It just means that the discussion can start, and I think it's a realistic prospect, and it would send a clear signal without accelerating the process and changing the rules of the game. Yeah.
All right, we're almost at the end of our meeting. So I also want to give the opportunity to our two consuls, if they want to add a word or two to what has been said. If you want to, if not, that's fine too.
Sure, I'm very happy to. If that's okay. Can
Sure.
you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, no, thank you for the insights. We have very interesting insights and complementary insights of our two panelists. I think there is a very strong commitment, just to react on the last point, a very strong commitment from European member states to provide as much support as possible to Ukraine, and that's taking a military form, it's taking a humanitarian form, As for diplomatic contacts with Russia, as it has been said, these contacts have been made at the request and in coordination with President Zelensky. This is really important to highlight, and it's, as it has been said, not something that is detrimental to, in any regard, to Ukraine. In the contrary, and so this is the job of diplomacy, to actually talk to those you don't want to talk to, and this is really. It's not because you're talking to someone that you adhere in any way to what is being done. So this is what President Macron, as chair of the EU Council, is doing. That's the first point. The second point, as to the accession of Ukraine, has been highlighted that there are many other states that have actually submitted a request for membership, and this takes a whole procedure. I don't think it's an issue, as it has been said. It's not a request of Ukraine. It's not an issue that is an answer to the current situation, as President Macron has highlighted, there should definitely be a political ensemble, above the economic and political group, which was called the European political community, and this is an avenue that should be explored. And it has been said, we are open to institutional thoughts and look at the institutional way of addressing this. But there is really a very strong support to the Ukrainian crisis, and also I think a very candid and very clear also understanding of the Russian threat. But also taking into account, the economic connections that exist and that cannot be disrupted immediately. And as for, the commitment of European partners, especially of France, for example, in Eastern Europe, I think, Christophe, you mentioned the Baltic states and the fact that they felt there wasn't enough support. We have several hundreds of French troops right now, within the NATO troops in Estonia right now. So we're very aware of a strategic threat that exists at the eastern flank of NATO, and so there is no question about this at all. I think that's the main points I wanted to react to. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Frédéric. Oliver, do you want to add anything?
Sure. Maybe I could pick up on Frédéric's last point, which I think is really important in this context, because it's certainly CFSP and of course the political main developments that have to follow are important, but European integration and the feeling of European Union is also about gestures, about presence. So Frédéric mentioned the French presence in Estonia. I could mention the German lead in Lithuania, the battle group, and also, of course, the many European Germans, among them military presences in Romania. That is something right on the eastern border of the European Union, and that is certainly something that must and will inspire and instill maybe a feeling that has been a bit lost over recent years with the haggling with regard to human rights, democracy, freedom of press, think Poland, think Hungary. But I think this is something that kind of is something that could also refuel a little bit this feeling of unity and union that maybe has been lost over time. We saw that also spring up from time to time during the Brexit process. Winston Churchill once said, maybe without sounding too cynical, never let a crisis go to waste. And I think that is something that we definitely see. And of course, I understand that a lot of criticism directed now in the media at the German government and other governments in Europe with regard to delivery of heavy weapon and with regard of the weaning off process of Russian gas is is of course all right, and that has to be pronounced and said. But as I mentioned earlier, and Frederick also mentioned, it's not an easy task. We have to keep our economies going. Economies, by the way, that are just coming out of a COVID pandemic 2-year process. So in the middle of a process to restart the engines and to get our labor markets and our economy supply chains going again. So that is something that as a head of government and also as a head of the Commission, EU Commission has to look at. It's a game, if you want, with several elements. But make no mistake, I think the German government and our partners, we have made many important decisions. Frederick mentioned the 2% goal GDP for German defense expenditures. We've just, with a 2/3 majority, decided to change our constitution with regard to 100 billion stowed away for military expenditure. So that is a major shift. We have the accession demands by our Nordic partners. So the landscape will be totally reshaped. I don't want to prognostice with regard to the quickness of the process of accession and who comes first. Ukraine has already had an association agreement with the EU. So maybe what's needed on the military side, defense side, can go on. But nevertheless, that's a clear stop sign with regard to, and will probably very attentively be seen by our so-called systemic rivals on how the West has reacted. Of course, it's a tentative process. I mean, nobody's ever said we have a ironclad, clear-cut strategy already, because this is something completely new, unexpected, unreal in a way, uncanny. But we are getting our act together. And even if you looked at yesterday night's haggling together with Hungary on when to stop, we're moving. It's a big ship, the EU. Yes, it is, but it's moving forward. And I'm glad maybe to say a final word that Olaf Scholz is taking the cautious line together with President Macron. Well, think about Germany. I think about Germany 30 years ago when the reunification happened, and so there was so much angst going around in Europe about a strong, almost invincible Germany that should push all the other partners to the wall. Now look at some of the commentaries that directed at Germany now asking for a new European leadership, taking the forefront, delivering weapons left and right, and almost granting its superpower status. I'm glad that we're not going down that road, because the European Union is an association of partners and friends, and things have to be decided at best together if we can. And certainly we need to change some of the structures. Maybe some of the decision making is too slow. But think about a different attitude that Germany would take. Then I think the outcry would be even bigger. So I'm really pleased at the moment with the line we're taking. Also, with regard to the telephone calls, Frederick is absolutely spot on. I mean, you have to talk. You have to feel the pulse from time to time. You have to talk, even to Putin, to find out what the situation is, and if there's any chance for a ceasefire or standstill of war. Then that chance has to be taken. By the way, it has not been taken only during the last calls, but before the war started, during. So it's a constant exercise. And of course, there are nicer and not so nice interlocutors, but that's what diplomacy is about. And I think Germany and France are acting very responsibly together with other partners in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Then, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our meeting already. Actually, we've gone a bit over time. But thank you very much to our two panelists, Gisela and Pierre, for these very interesting points and exchanges. Thanks also to our two consul generals for co-organizing this and for giving their views. Thanks to the audience for being here with us. And then the only thing that is left to me is to wish you a very nice summer. This is the last public event of the Europe Center for this academic year. So we will see each other back after the summer at the end of September. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.